It was universally voted on Monday that the Englishman should follow Father Miron, and we looked with some satisfaction on his wholesome face and steady blue eyes as he took up his tale after supper. "Mine is a very poor story," he began. "After the one we heard on Saturday, and what is worse, there is no explanation that I have ever heard that seemed to me adequate. Perhaps someone will supply one this evening. I feel very much like an ant in London, who Monseigneur has such sympathy with." He drew at his cigarette, smiling, and we settled ourselves down with looks of resolute science on our features. I at least was conscious of wishing to wear one. After my ordination to the subdiaconate, I was in England for the summer, and I went down to stay with a friend on the Fal at the beginning of October. My friend's house stood on a spot of land running out into the estuary. There was a beechwood behind it, and on either side. There was a small embankment on which the building actually stood, of which the seawall ran straight down onto the rocks, so that at high tide the water came halfway up the stonework. There was a large smoking room looking the same way, and a little paved path separated its windows from the low wall. We had a series of very warm days when I was there, and after dinner we would sit outside in the dark and listen to the water lapping below. There was another house on the farther side of the river, about half a mile away. We could see its lights sometimes. About 3 miles upstream, that is, on our right, lay Truro, and Falmouth, as far as I remember, about 4 miles to the left. But we were entirely cut off from our neighbours by the beech woods all round us, and except for the house opposite, might have been clean out of civilization. Father Brent tossed away his cigarette and lit another. He seemed a very sensible person, I thought, unlike the excitable Frenchman, and his manner of speaking was serene and practical. "My friend was a widower," he went on, "but had one boy, about 11 years old, who I remember was to go to school after Christmas. I asked Franklin, my friend, why Jack had not gone before, and he told me, as parents will, that he was a peculiarly sensitive boy, a little hysterical at times, and very nervous, but he was less so than he used to be, and probably, his father said, if he was allowed time, school would be the best thing for him. Up to the present, however, he had shrunk from sending him. He has extraordinary fancies," Franklin said, "and thinks he sees things. The other day," and then Jack came in, and he stopped, and I clean forgot to ask him afterwards what he was going to say. Now, if anyone here has ever been to Cornwall, he will know what a queer country it is. It is crammed full of legends and so on. Everyone who has ever been there seems to have left his mark. You get the Phoenicians in goodness knows what century. They came there for tin, and some of the mines still in work are supposed to have been opened by them. Cornish cream seems too to have been brought there by them, for I need not tell you that perhaps the stuff is originally Cornish and not Devon. Then Solomon, some think, sent ships there, though personally I believe this is nonsense. But you get some curious names, Marazion, for instance, which means the bitterness of Zion, that has made some believe that the Cornish are the lost tribes. Then you get a connection with both Ireland and Brittany in names, language, beliefs, and so forth. I could go on forever. They still talk of going to England when they cross the border into Devonshire. Then the people are very odd. Real Celts with a genius for religion and the supernatural generally. They believe in pixies. They've got 100 saints and holy wells and holy trees that no one else has ever heard of. They have the most astonishing old churches. There's one convent, Lanherne, I think, where the Blessed Sacrament has remained with its light burning up to the present. And lastly, all the people are furious Wesleyans. So the whole place is a confusion of history, a sort of palimpsest, as Father Rector here would tell us. A cross you find in the moor may be pagan, or Catholic, or Anglican, or most likely all three together. And that is what makes an explanation of what I'm going to tell you such a difficult thing. I did not know much about this when I went there on the 3rd of October, but Franklin told me a lot, and he took me about to one or two places here and there, to Truro to see the new cathedral, to Peranzabulo, where there's a sort of old mystery theatre and a church in the sands, and so on. One day we rode down to Falmouth. The estuary is a lovely place when the tide is in. You find the odd combination of seaweed and beech trees growing almost together. The trees stand with their roots in saltish water, and the creeks run right up into the woods. But it's terrible when the tide is out. Great sheets of mud with wreckage sticking up, and draggled weed and mussels, and so on. About the end of my first week, it was high tide after dinner, and we sat out on the terrace looking across the water. We could hear it lapping below, and the moon was just coming up behind the house. I tossed over my cigarette and heard it fizz in the water. Then I put out my hand to the box for another. There wasn't one, and Franklin said he would go indoors to find some. He thought he had some nesters in his bedroom. So Franklin went in, and I was left alone. It was perfectly quiet. There was not a ripple on the water, which was about 8 feet below me, as I got up from my chair and sat on the low wall. There was a sort of glimmer on the water from the moon behind, and I could see a yellow streak clean across the surface from the house opposite among the black woods. It was as warm as summer, too. Father Brent threw his cigarette away and sat a little forward in his chair. I began to feel more interested. He was plainly interested himself, for he clasped his hands around his knee and gave a quick look into our faces. Then he looked back again at the fire as he went on. Then across the streak of yellow light, and where the moon glimmered, I saw a kind of black line moving. It was coming toward me. There seemed to be a sort of disturbance behind. I stood up and waited, wondering what it was. I could hear Franklin pulling out a drawer in the bedroom overhead, but everything else was deadly still. As I stood, it came nearer swiftly. Just a high ripple in the water, and a moment later the flat surface below heaved up, and I could hear it lapping and splashing on the face of the wall. It was exactly as if some big ship had gone up the estuary. I strained my eyes out, but there was nothing to be seen. There was a glimmer of the moon on the water, the house lights burning half a mile away, and the black woods beyond. There was a beach, rocks, shingle on my right, curving along toward a place called Meopas, and I could hear the wave hiss and clatter all along it as it went upstream. Then I sat down again. I can't say I was exactly frightened, but I was very much puzzled. It should surely not be a tidal wave. There was certainly no ship. It could not be anything swimming, for the wave was like the wave of a really large vessel. In a minute or two, Franklin came out with the nesters, and I told him. He laughed at me. He said it must have been a breeze, or the turn of the tide, or something. Then he said he had been in to look at Jack and found him in a sort of nightmare, tossing and moaning. He had not wakened him, he said, but just touched him and said a word or two, and the boy had turned over and gone to sleep. But I would not let him change the subject. I persisted it had been a really big wash of some kind. He stared at me. "Take a cigarette," he said. I found them at last under a hat. But I went on at him, and I made an impression and it had made an impression on me, and I was a little uncomfortable. "It is bosh," he said. "But we'll go and see if you like. The wall would be wet if it was a big wave." He fetched a lantern and went down the steps that led round the side of the embankment into the water. I went first, until my feet were on the last step above the water. He carried the lantern. Then I heard him exclaim, "You're standing in a pool," he said. I looked down and saw that it was so. The steps, 3 of them at least, were shining in the light of the lantern. I put out my hand for the lantern, held it on the ring by my left hand, and leaned out as far as I could, looking at the face of the wall. It was wet and dripping, for at least 4 feet above the mark of the high tide. I told him, and he came down and looked too, and then we went up to the house. We neither of us said very much more that evening. The only suggestion Franklin could make was that it must have been a very odd kind of tidal wave. For myself, I knew nothing of tidal waves, but I gathered from his tone that this certainly could not have been one. We sat out about half an hour more. There was no sound again. We went up to bed. We peeped into Jack's room. He was lying perfectly quiet on his right side, turned away from the window, which was open. There was a little frown, I thought, on his forehead, and his eyes seemed screwed up. The priest stopped again. We were all very quiet. The story was not exciting, but it was distinctly interesting, and I could see the others were puzzled. Perhaps what impressed us most was the very matter-of-fact tone in which the story was told. The rector put in a word during the silence. "How do you know it was not a tidal wave?" he asked. "It may have been, Father," said the young priest, "but that is not the end." He filled his lungs with smoke, blew out, and went on. Nothing whatever of any interest happened for the next day or two, except that Franklin asked a boatman at Meopas whether he'd heard anything of a wave on the Monday night. The man looked at us and shook his head, still looking at us oddly. "I was in bed early," he said. On the Thursday afternoon, Franklin got a note asking him to dine at Truro to meet someone who'd come down from town. I told him to go, of course, and he went off in his dog cart about 6:30. Jack and I dined together at 7:30, and I may say we made friends. He was less shy when his father was away. I think Franklin laughed at him a little too much, hoping to cure him of his fancies. The boy told me some of them, though, that night. I don't remember any of them particularly, but I do remember the general effect, and I was really impressed by the sort of insight he seemed to have into things. He said some curious things about trees and their characters. Perhaps you remember MacDonald's Fantastes. It was rather like that. He was fond of beeches, I gathered, and thought himself safe in them. He liked to climb them, and to think that the house was surrounded by them, and there were a lot of things like that, he said. I remember, too, that he hated cypresses and cats and the twilight. "But I am not afraid of the dark," he said. "I like the dark as much as the light, and I always sleep with my windows open and no curtains." Monseigneur Maxwell nodded abruptly. I could see he was watching. "I know," he said. "I knew another child like that." Well, went on Father Brent. The boy said good night and went to bed about 9. I sat in the smoking room a bit, for it had turned a little cold, and about 10 stepped out onto the terrace. It was perfectly still and cloudy. I forget whether there was a moon. At any rate, I did not see it. There was just the black gulf of water, with the light across it from the house opposite. Then I went indoors and shut the windows. I read again for a while and finished my book. I had said my office, so I looked about for another novel. Then I remembered there had been one I wanted to read in Franklin's room overhead, so I took a candle and went up. Jack's room was over the smoking room, and his father's was beyond it, on the right. There was a door between them. Both faced the front. Remember, Franklin's room had 3 windows, 2 looking onto the river, and 1 upstream to Truro. Over the beach I spoke of before. I went in there and saw that the door was open between the 2 rooms, so I slipped off my shoes for fear of disturbing the boy. I went across to the bookshelf that stood between the 2 front windows. All 3 windows were open. Franklin was mad about fresh air. I was bending down to look at the backs of the books and had my finger on the one I wanted when I heard a kind of moan from the boy's room. I stood up, startled, and it came again. Why, he'd had a nightmare only 3 days before, I remembered. As I stood there wondering whether it would be kind to wake him, I heard another sound. It was a noise that came through the side window that looked up the beach. It was the noise of a breaking wave. The priest made a momentary pause, and as he flicked the end of his cigarette, I saw his fingers tremble slightly. I didn't hesitate then, but went straight into the room next door. As I went across the floor, I heard the boy moaning and tossing. It was pitch dark, and I could see nothing. I was thinking that tidal waves don't come downstream. Then my knees struck the edge of the bed. Jack, I said, Jack. There was a rustle from the bedclothes, and I should have thought long before he could have awakened, I heard his feet on the floor and felt him brush past me. Then I saw him outlined against the pale window with his hands over the glass, on the glass over his head. Then I was by him, taking care not to touch him. All this took about 5 seconds, I suppose, from the time when I heard the wave on the beach. I stared out now over the boy's head, but there was nothing in the world to be seen but the black water and the glimmer of light across it. Jack was perfectly silent, but I could see he was watching. He didn't seem to know I was there. Then I whispered to him rather sharply, "What is it, Jack? What do you see?" He said nothing, and I repeated my question. Then he answered, almost as if talking to himself. "Ships," he said. 3 ships. Now I swear there was nothing there. I thought it was a nightmare. "Nonsense," I said. "How can you see them? It's too dark." "A light in each," he said. "In the bows, blazing." As he said it, I saw his head turning slowly to the left as if he was following them. Then there came the sound of the wave breaking on the stonework just below the windows. "Are you frightened?" I said suddenly. "Yes," said the boy. "Why?" "I don't know." And I saw his hands come down from the window and cover his face, and he began to moan again. "Come back to bed," I said, but I daren't touch him. I could see he was sleepwalking. Then he turned, went straight across the room, still making an odd sound, and I heard him climb into bed. I covered him up and went out. Father Brent stopped again. He had rather a curious look on his face, and I saw that his cigarette had gone out. None of us spoke or moved. Then he went on again abruptly. "Well, you know, I didn't know I was frightened exactly until I came out onto the landing. There was a tall glass there on the right hand of the staircase. Just as I came opposite, I thought I heard the hiss of the wave again, and I nearly screamed. It was only the wheels of Franklin's dog cart coming up the drive, but as I looked in the glass, I saw that my face was like paper. We had a long talk about the Phoenicians that evening. Franklin looked them out in the encyclopedia. There was nothing particularly interesting. Well, that's all. Give me a match, Father. This beastly thing's gone out. It's a spaghetto. We had no theories to suggest. Monsignor was temerarious enough to remark that the story was an excellent illustration of his own views.